We are ready to get started. So good morning, everyone. Bonjour. Thanks for joining us today. Merci de vous joindre à nous aujourd'hui. I'm going to pass it off to MP Niki Ashton, following by MP Lord Idlout. After they speak, we'll take questions from the media. To ask a question, please use the raise hand function, or you can send me a private message in the chat. Je vais céder la parole à Niki Ashton, puis Lord Idlout. Après leur intervention, nous allons répondre aux questions des médias. Pour poser une question, veuillez utiliser la fonction lever la main ou m'envoyer un message. Okay, over to you, Niki.
Thank you, Charlotte, and good morning, everybody. My name is Niki Ashton, and I'm the Member of Parliament for Churchill, Keewatin-Nukuski, as well as the Deputy Critic for Indigenous Services. And I'm joining you along with my colleague, Lori Idlout, MP for Nunavut, and the NDP Critic for Indigenous Services and Indigenous Crown Relations. We are here today to make a clear call to the Liberal government that we need the federal government to step up on housing for Indigenous communities. I'm joining you today from my home in Thompson on Treaty 5 territory, the territory of the Nishnawasi Cree Nation. Our region has a housing crisis, a clear housing crisis on First Nations. And as I visited in community after community over the last number of months, the number one issue raised with me is that of housing. And that has everything to do with the cuts, the austerity, the lack of funding, and the ongoing neglect from federal governments, both liberal and conservative. There is not one community in our region where I heard that the situation is getting better when it comes to housing. What I've heard loud and clear from leaders, from elders, from advocates, from young people is that the situation is getting worse. And we saw that during the COVID-19 crisis. One of the major contributing factors to outbreaks in Indigenous communities was housing insecurity. Was the fact that there are overcrowded homes, that there are homes that are mold infested, that there are homes that are not safe and healthy for people to live in. And this factor, the factor of housing insecurity led to people being more vulnerable to COVID-19 and played a key role in multiple outbreaks. We need to learn from the COVID-19 crisis. We need to learn directly from Indigenous communities, listen to what they are saying right now. And we need the federal government to act. For us in the NDP, housing for Indigenous communities is a priority, and that's why we are joining you today. We're less than a month into this new parliament, and we felt it was important to speak out. We also felt it was important to speak out because this government's throne speech made no mention of Indigenous housing, which is frankly unacceptable. So we are here saying today that this federal government has an obligation coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, has an obligation given the shocking level of housing insecurity that Indigenous communities face, and has an obligation overall to Indigenous communities to act when it comes to housing. And what we don't need is delay tactics. What we don't need is nice sounding words. What we need is action on the ground, construction on the ground. We need collaboration with Indigenous communities that are rearing to go, many who are doing very innovative work already to get results, to build homes, to renovate homes in communities now. We did send a letter, my colleague and I, Lori Idlout and I sent a letter to the new Minister of Indigenous Services, making it clear that we want the Liberals to follow through on their housing strategy that was promised 4 years ago. We based on figures that have already been made clear coming out of the reality of communities, we are saying that there need to be 21,000 homes built immediately, 50,000 homes in need of major repairs, and of course there needs to be ongoing work to assess exactly where Indigenous communities are at in terms of their housing needs. We believe that there must be a for Indigenous by Indigenous housing strategy. We need to see the federal government fix the rapid housing initiative, which is completely inadequate when it comes to Indigenous communities. We need to see it properly funded, and we need to see that money is doled out equitably. For us in Northern Manitoba, these kinds of investments ought to go hand in hand with an investment in an all-weather road. The reality is climate change is already hitting our communities hard. Northern and Indigenous communities are already paying the price of climate change, and we are seeing the ice roads that communities depend on to bring in housing stock, housing materials, and equipment are disappearing more and more. We need sustainable ways at addressing the housing and infrastructure needs of Indigenous communities in our region now. I'd like now to pass on the mic to my colleague, MP Lori Idlout, and I will be joining you right after again to speak to some of the specific realities of our constituency. Lori, go ahead.
Niki, it is my pleasure to have this joint presser with you. It's been such a pleasure to work with you, Niki, and I'm so honored that we can work together on pushing housing. And I also need to acknowledge the great work that my predecessor, Mumila Kakak, had undertaken when she was the MP before me. She had toured Nunavut to explore what the realities are for housing in Nunavut, and she ended up with a report in March 2021 where she took pictures and heard directly from families how deplorable the housing condition really is in Nunavut. To quote her, to quote Mumila Kakak, she said, "Promises don't get rid of mold. Empathy does not fix leaking pipes." We need to make sure that the good work that Mumila did, that the federal government is continued to be forced to learn, to hear, and to act on making sure that we're improving housing conditions for Nunavut, for Indigenous communities, for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit all across Canada. We need to make sure that we do better, and we need to make sure that the housing prices that we have been forced to live in, specifically since promises have been made that haven't been implemented, need to be acted on, and we need to make sure that people, most recently, a constituent of mine in Rankin Inlet approached me directly and said that she has 7 people living in a 1-bedroom unit. And there are far too many stories like these, not just in Nunavut, but also all across Canada. And we must do what we can to ensure that promises that were made are being followed, but that we go beyond those promises, because even those promises will not be sufficient to meet the housing needs of Indigenous people. Kuyanemik, Niki, for allowing me to also share my time to ensure that the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit are included, and we do what we can to make sure that we're doing better for all Indigenous Canadians.
Thank you, Lori. J'aimerais aussi partager quelques mots en français. Notre message aujourd'hui, pour assurer qu'on partage notre message ainsi avec les communautés francophones du Nord, les communautés autochtones du Nord. J'aimerais partager le fait qu'aujourd'hui, c'est un privilège de rejoindre ma collègue, la députée de Nunavut, Lori Idlout, ainsi que notre porte-parole sur les affaires autochtones. Et notre message aujourd'hui, c'est un message urgent, c'est un message clair. On demande au gouvernement fédéral, on demande aux libéraux d'agir avec urgence sur la crise de logement qui existe dans les communautés autochtones. C'était important pour nous de tenir cette conférence de presse juste quelques semaines après que la Chambre a siégé, parce que c'est essentiel que le gouvernement agisse avec un d'urgence. Aussi, il faut reconnaître que c'est inacceptable que le discours du trône n'a même pas mentionné la question de logement pour les communautés autochtones. Nous, au sein du NPD, on dit clairement que le logement pour les communautés autochtones, c'est une priorité pour nous autres et il faut qu'on voit de l'action de la part du gouvernement fédéral. On a envoyé une lettre à la nouvelle ministre des services pour les peuples autochtones. Et dans cette lettre, on fait clair, on partage un message clair qu'il faut que les libéraux donnent suite à la stratégie de logement qu'ils ont promis il y a 4 ans. On a partagé les chiffres qu'il faut bâtir 21 000 maisons immédiatement où les besoins sont urgents et un autre 50 000 ayant des besoins majeurs d'entretien. Il faut aussi collaborer avec les communautés autochtones pour s'assurer que les besoins comme ils sont maintenant sont bien représentés et agir sur cela. On a dit clairement qu'il faut avoir une stratégie en matière de logement par les Autochtones, pour les Autochtones, corriger l'initiative pour la création rapide de logements en la finançant adéquatement et en s'assurant que les fonds soient partagés de manière équitable. Et finalement, pour nous, ici au nord du Manitoba, la question d'investissement dans le logement pour les communautés autochtones veut dire aussi investir dans un réseau de routes permanentes. À cause du changement climatique, les routes de glace sont en train de... la période de temps où ils existent devient de plus en plus courte et il faut investir dans des routes permanentes pour que les matériaux, l'équipement pour pouvoir bâtir les maisons peut arriver aux communautés d'une façon soutenable aussitôt que possible. I'd also like to take a couple of minutes to share some words from communities in our region. I cannot underscore the extent to which this is a crisis, a real depiction of third world living conditions here in our country, one of the wealthiest countries in the world. I know our comms team would have sent you images from some of the housing situations that we're talking about. And I hope you'll take a look because this is what people are dealing with right now. Here in northern Manitoba, over the last number of days, we've had temperatures of -30, in fact, -40 with the wind chill. And you'll see in one of those pictures, there are people living in a school bus that's in Garden Hill First Nation. And Chief Knott of Garden Hill First Nation and his team sent me a message where they said recently there was a young couple and their 4 children that were living in an abandoned school bus in Garden Hill. Even in the cold months of the year, they basically had no place to live, so they decided to make a living space in the school bus. And while they were able to move just recently into the trailer that you see in those pictures, which as you will see is ought to be condemned, the chief's elderly brother moved into the school bus to allow space for the young family to move in to what was seen as somewhat of a better solution. So in that school bus, in -30-degree weather, there is an elder living there. There have been families or families with children living there. You know, I think we can all agree that in a country as wealthy as Canada, it is shocking, it is immoral, and it is frankly a clear alarm for change. And as we noted earlier, particularly coming out of the COVID-19 crisis, where we know inadequate, overcrowded housing was a major contributing factor to the spread of COVID-19 in Indigenous communities. We've also heard urgent calls for action from Opaskwayak Cree Nation, who've made very clear that housing insecurity is a major issue for them, from Barons River, from Tatasqueyak Cree Nation. There are resounding calls for action. And the ultimate message is that we need the federal government to step up. They've made promises they haven't kept. We know what needs to be done, and we need to move now, particularly coming out of the COVID-19 crisis, and looking ahead towards building safer communities for Indigenous peoples, and making a difference in people's daily life right now. That means investing in housing. That means ending the housing crisis for Indigenous communities now. And with that, I'd love to turn it back to Charlotte.
Thank you, Nikki and Lori. We are now ready to take questions from the media. As a reminder, to ask a question, please use the raise hand function, or you can send me a message in the chat. Nous sommes maintenant prêts à répondre aux questions. Pour rappel, pour poser une question, veuillez utiliser la fonction lever la main ou m'envoyer un message. So the first question is going to Olivia Stefanovich from CBC. Go ahead, Olivia.
Good morning. Thank you for taking our questions this morning. I do have a question about the housing announcement today, but I want to first start with a question to Lori about a petition you signed, the Wet'suwet'en Statement. I'm wondering if you can tell us why you signed this petition, and if you believe your party and leader are doing enough to denounce violence by the RCMP on Wet'suwet'en territory. And Nikki, I heard that you also signed this statement, so I'm wondering if you can comment and confirm as well.
Thank you, Olivia, for that question. I'm here today to discuss housing and how important it is for us to make sure that we keep pressuring the government to listen to the urgent calls from our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. I need to outline that as recently as November 25, the recently appointed Minister of Health for the government of Nunavut, John Main, unfortunately had to make a release saying that there's a TB outbreak in Pangnaktok, and the TB outbreak is in this time of year in 2021 is unacceptable. But most of the reason that outbreak was allowed to happen was because of overcrowded housing situation. And we need to make sure that we continue to focus on what the priorities we have based on what we've heard from our communities. And I hope that you report on the fact that housing is a major issue and that we need to ensure that we raise awareness about needing to meet the needs of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit because of the housing crisis that has lasted far too long for our communities.
Well, I would like to also share my colleague's sentiment that today we are here to talk about the housing crisis, and that's our focus of today's message, which is we need the federal government to act. Tuberculosis is also a concern here in communities in our region. I mean, who would think that in Canada in 2021 we would still have communities struggling with TB, and that again has everything to do with the housing crisis. And I also want to outline, I mean, there's a lot of interest from all parties on the issue of housing, but what we are saying in the NDP is that we need a clear strategy when it comes to the most housing insecure communities in the country, and that is Indigenous communities. I mean, you see it from the images. Anybody who's lived on a First Nation or in an Indigenous community, anybody who's worked or visited, will know that these are just not realities of urban centers. These are not the realities of most Canadians, and there is absolutely no reason for this reality to exist. It has everything to do with ongoing neglect and lack of funding, and unkept promises, like the Liberal promise of 4 years ago for an Indigenous housing strategy. And so we are looking forward in the NDP to push the federal government, the Liberals, to not just use slogans when it comes to working with Indigenous communities, but actually act on the priorities. And that means building homes, that means renovating homes, that means action to end the housing crisis in Indigenous communities now.
Do you have a follow-up, Olivia?
Thank you. Yes, I hear what you're saying about the subject of today's announcement. I'll just ask one more time to give you the opportunity, if you can answer, if you believe your party and leader are doing enough to denounce violence by the RCMP in Wet'suwet'en territory. And on housing, you mentioned that you'd like to see 21,000 homes built. We've seen this federal government spend quite a lot of money on housing, but it doesn't seem to be filling that gap. So I'm wondering why you think that is. Why don't we seem to be any closer to resolving this issue? What needs to change in this strategy?
Thank you, Olivia. I just need to reiterate, I know how important the other issue is, and I am willing to talk about it at a later point. I need to refocus today on how important it is that we talk about housing for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. Families, parents are losing their children to the foster care system because of the conditions of our homes. It is not acceptable that parents might be considered not adequate to raise their own children when the housing that's provided to them by the governments are not being renovated and not being kept up to date to the standards by governments. And at the same time, the government taking children from their parents because of the poor conditions. I really just needed to reiterate the importance of ensuring that we talk about housing in this presser today.
Yeah, similar to my colleague Lori Idlout, our focus today is on housing, the housing crisis in Indigenous communities. Olivia, you asked about what is wrong with the federal setup at this time. First of all, I mean, the Rapid Housing Initiative program is completely inadequate when it comes to Indigenous communities. Here in our region, we know of 2 First Nations out of 41 that were able to access the program as such. Increasingly, Indigenous communities are reliant on CMHC. What we need to see is an Indigenous housing strategy led by Indigenous communities and for Indigenous communities. We don't need to see the Ottawa knows best approach. We also don't need to see window dressing that programs like the Rapid Housing Initiative is going to make all the difference, because clearly it's not. It needs adequate funding, but the model also is not simply does not work as it's set up for Indigenous communities. I heard from First Nations that were being told to apply for grants for housing while they were dealing with a COVID outbreak, and and they said, how can we do that right now? We are literally fighting to save lives, and we're expected to pull capacity together that we don't have to apply for a grant to explain that we have a housing crisis when it's blatantly obvious, in part because of the COVID-19 outbreak in our communities. And one of those communities that raised this specifically was Bunabonabee Cree Nation, Oxford House. So clearly what's out there right now is not working. The housing crisis is only getting worse. And I look forward, including today, I understand housing will be a major focus in Parliament again. And for us in the NDP, it's really critical to push for concrete funding and immediate action from the federal Liberals when it comes to housing for Indigenous communities. The time is now.
Okay, thank you, Olivia. The next question will go to Marie Wolf from the Canadian Press. Go ahead, Marie.
Hi, I just wanted to ask about the COVID crisis and how poor housing has contributed to that, which you mentioned. And I wondered from Lori whether this has been a factor in Nunavut. And Niki, if you could tell us which communities in particular have been affected by this. And if I may, can I also ask for some detail? You said you wanted 21,000 homes built. Can you say, it doesn't seem very many, and I wondered where you thought they should be built initially. And equally, you said the strategy should be Indigenous led and run. So how practically would it work?
I'll be brief in my response. COVID-19 definitely was seen to be
increased because of the overcrowded housing situation, specifically in Akbiat. Akbiat suffered having COVID-19 in their community for months. And if it weren't for overcrowded housing, I think that they would have been able to manage it better, because the Chief Public Health Officer for Nunavut, Dr. Keith Patterson, did a great job ensuring that he was managing the entry of COVID-19 in Nunavut. So I'll leave the rest to Niki to respond.
Thank you, Lori. All of the communities in our region that dealt with a COVID-19 outbreak indicated that overcrowded housing was a key contributing factor. Most recently, Norway House Cree Nation, who was able to stave off COVID-19 outbreaks for most of the pandemic so far, was hit pretty hard this fall, including had many breakthrough cases. So people who were fully vaccinated that also got sick. And it was clearly laid out that this had one of the major contributing factors was overcrowded housing. And so there was no room for people to self-isolate properly. Obviously, COVID spread a lot faster, and that was clearly outlined by leaders. Other communities that had really severe outbreaks earlier on, Shamattawa First Nation, Red Sucker Lake, as well, Oxford House, Bunabanabe Cree Nation, also made very clear, the leadership of these communities made very clear that overcrowded housing was a major contributing factor to the spread of COVID-19. And what I would say from our end is the figure right now that's been outlined is 21,000, but that's only a start. We also know that there are extensive renovations that need to be made. For us, it is important to go further than that, but we're very clear that the status quo as is, which is a situation where we're basically being told by the federal Liberals that through their silence, that Indigenous housing isn't really even on the radar, wasn't in the throne speech, is just not acceptable. So what we're saying is this is a start, but we do need to go further, and we need to come up with a model that's Indigenous-led for Indigenous communities, that is responsive to Indigenous communities on the ground. This is a clear message I've heard time and time again. They know best what the housing shortage looks like in their communities, and right now, as it's set up, whether it's the rapid housing or CMHC, it takes far too long for their reality to be recognized, and in often cases it's grant-based programming, and many First Nations that are dealing with a housing crisis and have been dealing with a COVID-19 crisis do not have the capacity to apply for some of these grants that the federal government keeps promoting. What we need to see is a system that works for communities and ultimately make sure that there's shovels in the ground and houses getting built or houses getting renovated ASAP.
Thank you, Niki. Thanks, Marie. The next question will go to Fraser Needham at APTN. Go ahead, Fraser.
Thanks very much, and good morning. I just had, I guess the thing is that there is, as I'm sure you've noticed, that there is a housing, has been talked about a lot recently, but it seems, my take is it's kind of the housing that's getting talked a lot about in Parliament is aimed at I think at middle class or upper middle class Canadians, and then I think you're talking about a different sector of society that maybe is being unaddressed. So it is maybe I guess in the throne speech there's a lot of talk about rent to own and first home buying. Do you think maybe the government is sort of off on the wrong strategy here? Maybe, I mean, they may be adding over to an overvalued market in some of these areas rather than maybe addressing some of the shelter needs, because maybe does there need to be a refocus on affordable housing or just giving people shelter perhaps? That's the question, sorry.
For sure. Well, we absolutely need a refocus. I mean, there is a broader urgent need to address housing insecurity across our country, in urban centers and rural communities, absolutely. But what we are saying in the NDP is that you know, we can't talk about housing in Canada without an urgent call to action on housing for Indigenous communities. And like I said, the throne speech didn't even make mention of housing in Indigenous communities, which is totally unacceptable, particularly coming out of a pandemic where you know, we know from everybody, from leaders, from experts, that housing insecurity led to communities becoming more sick, to people becoming more sick. So you know, there's clearly you know, clear signs, clear messages that the time to act is now. And you know, I know that my colleague as well, Jenny Kwan, our housing critic, will be speaking more to our broader vision on housing and housing as a human right. But for us in the NDP, what's clearly necessary is priority on housing for Indigenous communities.
Okay, thank you.
Do you have a follow-up, Fraser?
Oh, I do actually. Thanks. You know, one of the things that just, and I'm sure you've both noticed it too, just visiting communities over the years, is that the you know, often part of the problem seemed to be this: the standard of housing was substandard on a lot of First Nations, Indigenous communities. There wouldn't be, perhaps, it just doesn't seem like regulations were enforced, perhaps, that you would see like in the city of Ottawa here or other places, you know, of these, and you have literally homes falling apart not that long after that they were built, you know, maybe 15, 20 years ago in some communities. So is that part of the problem as well, or something you want to see addressed, really, is to have quality housing in communities and some more standards, because that seems to be a big problem in a lot of First Nation communities as well.
Absolutely. It is a recurring message that, you know, in so many communities, due to a lack of funding and a lack of resources, that you do end up with substandard quality materials, and also contractors that come in to make a quick buck and leave, leaving the communities high and dry. You know, I've seen houses that have cracks in their you know, their foundation. We've seen houses where you know, you simply sort of botched carpentry, you know, standards that you certainly wouldn't see, would just not be deemed as acceptable in an urban center, right? So basically, absolutely, there need to be standards, and that's why for us it's really important to call for an Indigenous-led strategy where communities can decide what you know, what works best for them, and that there be standards in place so that they get the quality housing that and quality materials and that they deserve.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks, Fraser. And we'll go to Dylan Robertson from the Winnipeg Free Press. Go ahead, Dylan.
Hi there. Sorry I'm late. I was at another press conference and I might ask the same question, but thanks for having us today. I just wanted to ask about contact with ministers. Niki, I know that you'd written that letter to Minister Haidu shortly after she took on the portfolio. She said that she would raise the housing issue with Minister Hussein and how the strategy is working. So just wanted to know from both of you, Laurie and Niki, if you've had a chance to have a discussion with the ministers and what you make of what they said.
Yes, thank you for that question. I did speak with Minister Mark Miller briefly. I've also spoken with Minister Vandel for Northern Affairs, and it's great that they're willing to work together. We're just needing to make sure that in our willingness to work together that we start doing it sooner rather than later.
And I was just going to add, we have yet to hear back on our joint letter. And so very much looking forward to not just hearing back, but as my colleague Lori Idlout mentioned, a sense of urgency. The fact that the Liberal throne speech did not even reference Indigenous housing is a concerning sign, and we need to see the government not just indicate that this is a priority in line with what Indigenous communities are saying, but that they are willing to act on it, and that's why we're holding this press conference today.
Good stuff, Knocker Mick, thank you. And Niki, it's a bit of an inconvenient question, but I do have to ask about the Wet'suwet'en thing and the BC government. I know that Leah and some of your colleagues have asked Jagmeet to push your BC cousins on this. I'm just wondering your own perspective on this and whether you'll be signing that petition.
Yes, well, thanks, Dylan. We did mention at the beginning of the press conference or at the beginning of the Q&A that our focus today was on housing crisis, and we're not here to talk about other issues that are obviously important, but want to maintain the focus on housing and the crisis here in northern Manitoba and obviously in Nunavut and in Indigenous communities across the region.
We'll conclude today's press conference. Thank you so much to everyone for joining. Ceci met fin à la conférence de presse. Je vous remercie.
Thank you.